My name is Sandy Baird, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Electoral College, because I noted in this past election that there were once again complaints about this in an anachronistic institution that seems to govern who is going to be our next president and who won't be. So I'm here today to give a little bit of an explanation of what it is, because I've noted in all my teaching and in many of my other conversations that people do not understand the Electoral College, nor do they understand why we even have such an institution. Because remember, the real election of the President of the United States does not occur in the November elections in accordance with the general will. In December, a month after the general election that we all go and vote in that election, about a month later, a group of people known as the electors gather, rather in secrecy, no one knows who they are, and they gather a month later and they cast their votes for the President of the United States, and that is the vote that counts as the vote that does elect the President of the United States. The situation or the criticisms of the Electoral College seem to occur when the Electoral College decides who will be the president in contravention to who won the popular vote. In this election, Hillary Clinton appears to have won the popular vote, but President Trump, or President-elect Trump, seems to now have the Electoral College. This is not the first time that this has happened. Numbers of times this has happened when the Electoral College decides who will be the president, and it is in contradiction to who won the popular vote. For instance, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected, even though he did not get the popular vote. In the year 2000, in a very contested election, it was Al Gore who won the popular vote, but Bush, as we all know, President Bush, was anointed by the Supreme Court. In that election, something also very curious happened. Because it was contested and nearly tied in Florida, the Florida legislature announced that it was going to appoint or elect Bush, even though a recount had not occurred. And in fact, the Supreme Court, in the case Bush v. Gore, ultimately appointed, again, Bush, even though there had not been a recount. So this is not the first time that this anomaly has occurred. President Trump, or President-elect Trump, was elected in the will be elected in the electoral votes, but Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So why has this happened? Let me go back a little bit in history, because I think that we'll gain a little bit more of an understanding of exactly what the Electoral College is and why our first Constitution adopted an Electoral College in the first place, rather than having elections of the president by the principle of one man, one vote, as they do in other republics, for instance in France. The Constitutional Convention of the United States, which adopted the Constitution, occurred in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And there, in that convention, in those hot days, there were numbers of divisions among the delegates to that convention. They were split on class. They were split on ideology. They were split, though, primarily on sections. They were split between the North and the South, and that division has always been part of American politics. When the question came up, so there were many questions that came up during that convention, and there were different positions taken by lots of people, but the sectional division was often the deepest, most entrenched, and most antagonistic. There were three branches of government that were established in our Constitution: the courts, the presidency, and the Congress. The Congress, the way that the Congress was chosen was a very, very contentious issue. And again, that's split on southern and sectional and northern lines. Remember that the Congress of the United States consists of two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. At that Congress, it was decided that each state would have two senators, no matter their population. But it was in the House that this contest occurred. House, as we know, is selected, or the numbers of congressmen in each state are decided by the number of people in each state. So that was what was being contested. And how was the number of congressmen for each state decided? Well, that is decided on the basis of a census. A census is taken throughout the United States, I believe every 10 years, and based on the numbers of each state or the population of each state, therefore the numbers of congressmen is awarded to each state. How did that affect the first Constitutional Convention? Well, it was put out by the South, and I think that we might see reasons why. The Southern states argued that in the census, every person should be counted. Every single person in the South and in the North should be counted. Why was that so important to the South? The South was a plantation economy. Because it was a plantation economy, the South had many, many enslaved people, Black African Americans, who were held in bondage mainly in the Southern states. Enslaved peoples also existed in the North. However, there weren't as many, and in the North, there wasn't a strict plantation economy. So the numbers of Black people, enslaved people in the North were not as numerous in the South. In fact, in many Southern states, in Southern counties, Blacks outnumbered whites, which of course led to their terror. The terror was on behalf of the whites, who were terribly fearful of those Black majorities because they were slave owners and therefore had treated, as anybody would guess, were in power over their slaves' lives and often treated them cruelly. All right, so what does this have to do with the Electoral College? In the Constitutional Convention, the South argued to count every person that was alive in the United States. Why was that important to the South? Because that meant that if you counted every person, you would count Black people, enslaved people, and that would be included in the number of people that was in each state. A state like Virginia, therefore, had very large population because it included Black slaves. That would then determine the number of congressmen that was going to be granted to Virginia. So the South vociferously argued, count every person. The North, however, was kind of hip to the South and knew that the South, if they counted every person, would therefore control the House of Representatives, therefore the Congress, and therefore the Electoral College. And I'll get to that in a minute. What was the Northern position? The Northern position was count only free people. Do not count slaves at all. Since they couldn't vote, since they were not citizens of the United States, why would they be counted at all? So the Northern position was count no enslaved peoples. The Southern position was to count all enslaved peoples. Therefore, if that was the rule, the South would maintain political control, as I mentioned, over Congress, over the presidency through the Electoral College, and through the courts, which the president appointed. The North said, no, count only free people. Therefore, because the North had cities, therefore the North would have controlled the Congress, the presidency, and the courts. Okay, so how does this have to do with the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a sum of the senators and the number of congressmen. Okay, so it is 2 senators from every state, 2 senators per state, and the number of representatives. Okay, so in Vermont, how many representatives do we have? We have 1 representative. Therefore, we have in the Electoral College 3 votes. That's why nobody pays attention to us much up here, and that's probably not a bad idea. All right, so we have 3 electors. And in December, those 3 electors will go to vote, and most, I guess, they will vote for President-elect Trump. Maybe. The fact is, though, that many states do not have to vote with a popular vote. As I mentioned before, states often can go against the popular vote for some trick, I guess, in the Constitution. A state like Florida, on the other hand, so this would be the Vermont vote, but in the case of Florida, which is always contested, again, 2 senators, but 23 congressmen. Again, based on the population of Florida. So there's a huge discrepancy between the numbers of electors for a small state like Vermont, a medium-sized state like Florida, or a state like New York, which I believe has in the 50s because of their congressional districts. What again does this have to do with the history of our country? The reason that this count of population was so important to the South was that if every person was counted, that meant every slave was counted. That would give political control over the Union to the South. Therefore, they could also protect slavery if they had that political count. In the North, they said only count free people, and therefore they would control the Union. The compromise, when the South said, look, if you guys up north don't go our way, we're going to leave the Union. The North said, we can't afford that. Try to remember that in the beginning, we were 13 small colonies. We needed to sort of stand together at that time to avoid being retaken over by England or by another superpower in Europe. So the North compromised and gave a big concession to the South. And the compromise was the infamous 3/5 rule. So each black person or each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. And that's where this infamous 3/5 rule came from the institution of slavery. So from then on until the Civil War, black enslaved people or blacks which came from an enslaved mother would count as 3/5 of a person. That still gave an advantage, political advantage to the South, which essentially ruled Congress, the presidency, and the courts until Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. And then during the period that we now know as Reconstruction, after the Civil War, in 1867, after Lincoln was assassinated, the 14th Amendment was adopted as part of a Reconstruction package. And in that 14th Amendment, all people born in the United States, including former slaves, including all black people, became citizens of the United States, which effectively countermanded the 3/5 rule. So that's the history of the Electoral College as I understand it, and as many scholars have commented on it. I wish more Americans understood that this institution is rooted in slavery, racism, white supremacy, and I don't believe that it will be abolished, and though it should be. But don't hold your breath anytime soon. This is Sandy Baird about the Electoral College.